Enormous amounts of money were in play, yet the WTA wasn't seeing a cent of it. Corporations were not merely courting Eala, they were deserting the tour as a whole. A 19-year-old from the Philippines now had more commercial pull than a professional league built over 50 years. This wasn't achieved through winning Grand Slams or dominating the rankings, but through a force much more unsettling to the system's raw, uncontainable cultural charisma. And as the monetary figures began to leak, the world of tennis did more than just take notice. It held its collective breath. What was happening was not just another sponsorship story, it was a fundamental realignment of power. It was a quiet corporate coup wearing a tennis dress. Whoa. And the WTA was completely blindsided by its arrival. Stay with us, because by this story's end, you will grasp why the most significant contest in women's tennis today is being waged far away from any court. A rare type of athlete exists who grows bigger than their sport before the sport itself can fully grasp their significance. Muhammad Ali was one, Serena Williams was another. And now, whether the WTA establishment is ready for it or not, Eala is doing the same on a scale that has corporate strategists from Manila to Manhattan completely redrawing their marketing maps. Born in the Philippines, forged by uncompromising discipline, and honed at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Eala brought an element to professional tennis that no amount of coaching can instill. She brought a narrative, a deeply authentic story that crossed continents and generations, striking a chord with billions of people in Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas all at once. That particular formula, the underdog, background, the elite European development, the magnetic personality, it all merged into what marketing insiders privately termed the perfect storm of cultural relevance. And major corporations recognized this potential long before her ranking reflected it. By the time Eala was having her breakout moments on the WTA circuit, her social media influence had already dwarfed that of dozens of more established players. Her engagement statistics on Instagram weren't just impressive for someone in tennis. They were exceptional for an athlete in any sport anywhere on the entire globe. Brands that measure genuine audience loyalty, looking beyond follower numbers to the actual emotional commitment from communities, were witnessing figures that forced their analysts to verify the data twice. Athletic apparel companies, high-end watchmakers, tech behemoths, and telecommunications firms with massive consumer bases in Southeast Asia were all involved. They weren't merely showing interest, they were in a fierce competition for her. Privately, initial exploratory talks were rapidly evolving into firm multi-million-dollar propositions. And most importantly, these offers were not being funneled through the WTA's official partnership network. They were going straight to Eala's management team. This is a hugely important distinction. The WTA functions with a conventional sports marketing framework. It relies on centralized sponsorship deals, official tour-wide partnerships, and financial models designed to benefit the organization as a whole. For many decades, that model was incredibly effective, but it was conceived for a different time. It was from before a single personality could command more digital engagement than the entire entity promoting her. Eala was an eventuality the traditional system had failed to anticipate. A player whose personal brand had a gravitational pull so strong it was yanking sponsors out of the tour's established orbit. This wasn't because of any controversy or public dispute, but simply because she connected with the public on a wavelength the WTA's institutional messaging could no longer reach. In the inner sanctums of tennis, the rumors began to spread. Agents for other athletes started to hear from their brand partners that budgets were being shifted and reevaluated. Tournament directors noticed that responses to their sponsorship renewal offers were growing cooler. The capital wasn't leaving women's tennis. It was consolidating all of it, drawn towards a single point of immense cultural influence. And that point was a person. That person had a backhand that could halt a conversation. And that person was only getting warmed up. Consider this. When was the last time a single teenager caused billion-dollar companies to completely scrap their sports marketing strategies? Because that moment was no longer on the horizon. It had already happened. Financial figures have a habit of escaping the very rooms they were meant to be confined to. The amounts being discussed in the private negotiations for Eala's personal endorsement deals were not your average contracts. These were nothing like the typical mid-level agreements that professional players ranked outside the top 10 usually managed to get. What was appearing on confidential proposals and in preliminary drafts signified a tier of financial investment that put Eala, a player still on the rise, in the same commercial stratosphere as established Grand Slam champions. Buzz from sports business insiders suggested that individual brand proposals were hitting numbers that, when pooled together from various partners, would create a total portfolio valued not in millions, but in the billions when forecasted over several years. A telecommunications titan with deep market penetration across Southeast Asia was rumored to be one of the main bidders. Numerous athletic wear corporations, recognizing the cultural power Eala held over a huge and quickly expanding consumer group, had initiated serious negotiations. Technology firms, in search of a credible ambassadorial voice for developing markets, considered her an essential partner. The truly remarkable thing about these offers was not just their size, but their design. Companies were not coming to Eala's team to see how she might fit into their existing WTA-related marketing plans. Instead, they were designing entirely bespoke deals, offering creative collaborations, equity positions, and branded media ventures, long-term ambassador platforms that treated her as a media company in her own right, not merely as an athlete for hire. One marketing analyst, in a frank discussion with an industry publication, described the dynamic with unflinching honesty. It became clear to brands that the emotional bond Eala forged with her audience was more effectively tapped by bypassing the tour itself. The WTA's formal partnership structure, though effective for targeting the general tennis fan base, couldn't provide access to the dedicated, fiercely loyal, and culturally unique communities that followed Eala's career. For the WTA, this shift in the landscape had profound financial repercussions. When corporate sponsorship funds are rerouted from league-wide partnerships to individual athlete endorsements outside of the tour's framework, the entire system's leverage weakens. Other athletes suffer from reduced exposure. Smaller events face cuts to their funding sources. The entire sporting ecosystem begins to feel the strain, and one particular aspect made the tension exceptionally sharp. This was not a situation Eala had deliberately orchestrated. She wasn't actively setting herself up in opposition to any organization. Her management was simply executing an appropriate commercial plan in response to unprecedented market interest. This is not an act of insurgency, it is simply business, but the effect on the WTA was the same regardless of her intentions. In private meetings, executives on the tour were engaged in some very difficult discussions. How can an organization maintain its value to sponsors when one of its own athletes becomes a more compelling investment than the whole platform? How can you update business models created before the rise of social media to account for a player whose personal reach eclipses that of the institution? These were no longer theoretical matters for strategic planning. They were problems that required immediate solutions, and the WTA, for reasons that were about to become widely known, appeared to be looking for them much too slowly. The billion-dollar issue was not about whether Eala was worthy of such deals. No one was seriously challenging that point. The more disturbing question circulating in tennis boardrooms was a different one entirely. Had the WTA already ceded control of the commercial story? And if that was the case, could it ever be fully regained? During times of institutional turmoil, silence is never merely an absence of noise. It speaks volumes. As brand negotiations around Eala grew more intense, and sports business outlets started to publicly piece things together, the WTA's own communication channels were notably inactive. There was no official statement, no strategic declaration to shape the narrative, and no discernible move to redefine the business debate on their own terms, just a profound quiet at the very time when bold action was most needed. That inaction proved to be devastating. In today's media landscape, when an organization loses control of its own story, it does much more than just create an empty space. It effectively passes the megaphone to every other interested party. Writers covering tennis, analysts of sports marketing, fan groups on several continents, and rival sports leagues all jumped at the chance to define the narrative the WTA had left vacant. The story that was being shaped without their input was anything but complimentary. It painted a picture of a governing body taken completely by surprise by a change that, with the benefit of hindsight, had been brewing for years. The complex institutional factors that led to this sluggish response were varied. The WTA functions across numerous global regions, trying to balance the conflicting priorities of players, tournaments, media partners, and long-standing corporate sponsors all at once. The process of making decisions in that kind of environment is methodical by nature, which under normal conditions is a hallmark of responsible management. However, the conditions surrounding Eala's meteoric commercial success were far from normal. Urgency was paramount. Change was desperately needed, yet a rapid response was not forthcoming. In the meantime, individual sponsors who were becoming wary of the WTA's strategic direction started to entertain talks that would have been inconceivable only a few months before. Companies with long-term stable and mutually rewarding tour sponsorships were all of a sudden posing basic questions about their return on investment. Were marketing efforts associated with the WTA still effective at connecting with the most crucial consumer groups? Or had those consumer groups moved on, drawn to particular athletes, compelling narratives, and unique cultural events that existed completely apart from official channels? The conclusions these sponsors were reaching from their own data were extremely unsettling for the tour's executives. The numbers from digital analytics are not open to debate. Information showing audience movement does not care about historical partnerships, and the clear verdict from several separate business evaluations was the same. The WTA's effectiveness in reaching certain high-demand demographic groups had noticeably declined. As Eala's personal brand grew stronger, athletes across the tour began to experience the knock-on effects. The nature of discussions with their own potential sponsors was beginning to change. Brand managers who once saw an alignment with the WTA as a clear benefit were either mentioning it less or discussing it with new caveats. The institutional backing that had once greatly increased in individual players' financial worth was starting to have less of an impact, and experienced players talking to sports reporters anonymously voiced their deep-seated frustration. They had put in years of work to build the collective commercial standing of the WTA. To many, the organization's silence at a critical juncture felt like a colossal failure of leadership, one that risked demolishing years of shared progress. But officially, there was still nothing. The WTA's failure to communicate was far more than a simple public relations error. It served as a warning to every corporate sponsor reviewing its ties to women's tennis that the association was either unaware or indecisive about how to handle its own evolution. For sponsors who were used to aligning with progressive and clearly communicative organizations, such a signal was a serious red flag. Every single day of silence from the organization had a tangible cost, and the debt was mounting quickly. When big companies start quietly pulling back their financial support, they never call it a withdrawal. They always use softer terminology. You hear phrases like strategic reallocation, portfolio reassessment, or shifting investment priorities. But the corporate jargon all means the exact same thing. The funding is disappearing, and for women's tennis it was vanishing at a startling rate. The sponsors didn't leave with big dramatic announcements. The slow decay of institutional partnerships just doesn't work like that. It occurs during renewal talks that fizzle out through contract options that are allowed to lapse and via partnership deals that just aren't renewed with the same prior enthusiasm or financial commitment. The commercial bedrock of the sport started to show cracks slowly at first, and then all at once. A number of well-known brands in the WTA sphere started funneling large shares of their sports advertising money into partnerships with individual players, bypassing the tour's official framework. The reasoning that fueled these moves was uncomplicated, and from a strictly business viewpoint, completely logical. Fan engagement figures for specific athletes. Eala being the most striking case, though not the only one, were consistently better than the tour's own marketing data. For companies focused on maximizing every marketing dollar against a provable audience reaction, the answer was simple. The entire tournament circuit felt the consequences right away. Smaller WTA tournaments, which are much more reliant on sponsor money than on television revenue, started facing severe budget limitations. Debates over prize money became far more contentious. The entire support system for hundreds of athletes on the professional tour, the players who would never secure individual $1 billion deals, but who represent the competitive heart of elite tennis, began to feel a tremendous amount of pressure. This particular aspect of the fallout was hardly ever a major news story. The main story in the media revolved around Eala's phenomenal commercial success. The less covered yet more significant story was the toll her immense commercial gravity was taking on the players who would never directly profit from it. A player ranked in the middle tier of WTA competitions gains no benefit from Eala's endorsement deals, but she suffers when those same deals siphon funds away from the collective system that sustains her career. A few respected figures in the tennis world started to bring this issue to public attention. The discourse was not aimed as a personal criticism of Eala. Pretty much everyone conceded that she had not caused the problem, nor was it her burden to fix. The frustration was aimed at the flawed business model of the sport and at leaders who appeared ill-prepared to manage the new reality. Sports economists looking into the matter pointed out a disturbing similarity to trends that had previously wrecked other professional sports organizations. When a single player's commercial appeal soars past the brand value of the institution, the distribution of income in the sport becomes completely skewed. The superstars with massive personal brands rake in incredible sums, while all the other players are left with growing financial insecurity. The middle ranks of the sport, which are vital to its health in the long run, are put in a financially dangerous spot. The WTA needed to implement immediate and clever structural changes to deal with this situation. The tour required business strategies that could recognize and leverage a single player's extraordinary value while still safeguarding the shared revenue that keeps everyone afloat. The exodus of sponsors was loudly answering the question of whether the current leadership was capable of this. The corporate pullout was never actually about Eala. It was a judgment on whether the WTA had adapted fast enough to stay commercially indispensable in a completely changed media world. And the decision on that matter at that very moment was sharp and undeniable. The verdict was in. All attention then shifted to one interview, and what unfolded next was something absolutely no one saw coming. There are certain times in sports when a player says something so sharp, so brutally honest, it slices through all the official messaging and connects with the public like a perfectly hit winner. Eala created precisely such a moment, and the online world did not simply respond, it erupted. In a widely shared interview that spread like wildfire, Eala tackled the business matters surrounding her career with a candor that took almost every observer by surprise. She wasn't being combative. She wasn't airing a grievance or attempting to create drama. Her delivery was calm, intelligent, and so controlled that her words landed with more force than any emotional display ever could have. She discussed standing for something greater than personal victory, and about being aware that her public profile, she felt a duty to the Filipino, Southeast Asian, and young female communities worldwide who found their own stories in her efforts to balance commercial deals with a sense of integrity. At the same time, she insisted her own worth and authentic cultural impact be recognized on terms that lined up with the actual world. Then she uttered something that brought the conversation to a dead stop. She noted, not with resentment but with piercing clarity, that the systems governing professional women's tennis were not built for athletes like herself. These were athletes whose marketability stemmed more from a deep cross-cultural appeal than from their ranking alone. These were athletes who built connections with their followers completely outside of the sport's official channels. These were athletes whose very presence challenged the long-held beliefs about how worth is calculated and rewarded within professional sports. Those remarks instantly spread across the globe, with sports media broadcasting them within a matter of hours. Publications from the marketing world dissected her words with a keen sense of wonder. Her fan base throughout Southeast Asia responded with an outpouring of immense pride and heartfelt connection. Tennis enthusiasts around the world jumped into massive discussions on fairness, financial equality, and the responsibilities of the sport's governing bodies, sparking millions of online posts. The true force of that moment did not come from a sense of confrontation. It came from the deep-seated logic in what Eala was articulating, making it impossible for anyone hearing it to write her off as naive or self-serving. The points she made about the system were precise, easy to confirm, and echoed worries that insiders like players, commentators, and economists had been voicing in private for some time. That a 19-year-old at the heart of this firestorm could express these truths with such calm exactness was truly exceptional. The WTA's official reply to her interview was predictably slow to come. When the formal statements were finally released, they came across as self-protective instead of thoughtful. Astute commentators remarked that a truly self-assured organization would have considered Eala's points seriously instead of just brushing them off with corporate speak. The stark difference between her poise and the organization's clumsy response only served to increase public support for her. Online fan groups, especially in the Philippines and greater Southeast Asia, elevated the event to a significant cultural moment. Video snippets from her interview were viewed hundreds of millions of times. Her name, along with related hashtags, completely took over social media trends on several platforms for days on end. Global news organizations that almost never reported on women's tennis were now publishing major articles about her. Throughout this entire whirlwind, Eala kept her composure, showed grace, and stayed focused on her game as the business and institutional worlds spun around her. This self-control, perhaps even more than any single thing she said, sent a powerful message about who she was and made her even more desirable to the companies already offering her massive endorsement deals. A single question began to dominate every discussion concerning women's tennis. Was this just a brief disruption, or did it signal a fundamental change? Eala had not declared war on the WTA. She had merely outgrown the confines of the current system, and brands were naturally drawn to her authentic influence. Fans are drawn to real connection, and an organization designed for a different time was now being left behind by a teenager who carried the athletic dreams of a whole country. The data speaks for itself. Sponsors who pull their funding are not swayed by emotion. A genuine change has occurred, and women's tennis will never be the same. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe, because the most important history of women's tennis is unfolding as we speak, and you won't want to miss anything.